Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel Med Edophilia. Today let's discuss about the lesson breathing and exchange of gases. This is an extremely important lesson, a very easy as well as an interesting chapter. So it will help you to build a base for the respiratory system unit of physiology of MBBS first year. So starting off, is breathing and respiration one and the same? So breathing is the common term that we use for inhalation or inspiration or breathing in and expiration or exhaling. So breathing is just a simple process of exchange of oxygen from the atmosphere with carbon dioxide produced by the cells. Whereas respiration involves breathing, the simple breathing or pulmonary ventilation, diffusion of gases across the alveolar membrane, transport of gases by the blood, diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and tissues, as well as utilization of oxygen by the cells, which is known as cellular respiration. The last step is known as cellular respiration. So these 5 steps together is what is known as respiration. And of course, as we see here, breathing forms the first step of respiration. So thus breathing and respiration, they are not the same. So different organisms have different respiratory structures. The respiratory structure and the mechanism of breathing depends on the habitat and the levels of organization of different animal groups. Starting off with the very primitive organisms, that is the invertebrates like the sponges, coelenterids and the flatworms, platyhelminthes, they respire through the body surface area by the mechanism of simple diffusion. Whereas in earthworms, it is the cuticle, that is the non-cellular waxy layer that is secreted by the cells. So this cuticle helps in respiration. In arthropods, particularly the terrestrial arthropods, we have tracheal tubes, network of tubes, spiracles. Whereas for aquatic arthropods, mollusks and fish, we have gills as respiratory organs. Well-known respiratory organ, that is the lungs, is the respiratory organ for terrestrial vertebrates like reptiles, birds and mammals. So what is the respiratory organ for amphibians like frog? So frogs, they are terrestrial as well as aquatic. So their respiratory organs are 3 in number. Gills when they are in aquatic environment and lungs and also through skin. So from now on, let's discuss about the human respiratory system in detail. So let's trace the human respiratory passage. So starting from the external nostrils, it leads to a short passage known as the nasal passage and finally into the nasal chamber or nasal cavity, and then it leads to the pharynx. Pharynx is divided into 3 parts: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx. So the oropharynx is the common passage for both food as well as air, and from here it leads to via the laryngopharynx we get into the larynx. So till here it is referred to as the upper respiratory tract. From the larynx it gives way to the trachea. The trachea, it is approximately 12 centimeters in length. So it is a straight tube, the trachea or the windpipe. It divides into a right and left primary bronchi at the level of T5 vertebra, 5th thoracic vertebra. This further divides into number of branches which ultimately gives rise to secondary bronchi. This secondary bronchi further divides to give rise to tertiary bronchi. Tertiary bronchi. Each of the tertiary bronchi divides again and again to give rise to initial bronchioles, which again divides to give rise to secondary bronchioles, which again divides and give rise to tertiary bronchioles, and finally terminal bronchioles, which are very thin. So it is important to note that the trachea, the primary, secondary and tertiary bronchi, also the initial bronchioles, they are supported by C-shaped incomplete cartilaginous rings. These cartilaginous rings, they are made of hyaline cartilage. They are C-shaped, that is, they are deficient posteriorly. Okay, so you should know till where these cartilaginous rings are present. These cartilaginous rings start from the trachea and they are present till the initial bronchioles. So the main function of these cartilaginous rings is to prevent the collapse of the tubes and to enable proper airway passage. Now each of the terminal bronchiole gives rise to a number of very thin, irregular walled, vascularized bag-like structures known as alveoli. So the terminal bronchioles gives rise to something known as alveolar ducts. Finally they open into a chamber known as atria, which is the sinus. Okay, it is an open space which gives rise to alveolar sac and finally into alveoli. So we can divide the human respiratory passage into two parts, the conducting part and the respiratory part or the exchange part. So the conducting part starts from the external nasal aperture and terminates till the bronchioles, up to the terminal bronchioles, whereas the alveoli and their ducts together form the respiratory or the exchange part. So in the following structures, what are the structures that are intrapulmonary? So do you understand the term intrapulmonary? The structures which are present within the lungs, and what are the structures that are present outside the lungs? So the branching network of bronchi, bronchioles and the alveoli together comprise the lungs. So the intrapulmonary structures includes the bronchi, bronchioles and the alveoli, right? So have a look at this simplified flowchart to answer many MCQs. So apart from this flowchart, you need to keep in mind 3 points. The level of bifurcation of trachea, which is T5. Second, till which level is the cartilaginous ring present. It starts from the trachea till the initial bronchioles. Okay. And then you should know the level of the conducting part, till where does the conducting part extend and till where does the exchange or respiratory part extend. So these are the common MCQs that are asked from this topic. So the function of the conducting part is transportation of the air, atmospheric air, into the alveoli, and it helps in filtration or clearing of the air from the foreign particles. Third function is humidification, okay, and fourth function is to bring the air to the body temperature. Whereas the function of the exchange or respiratory part is the actual site of diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the atmospheric air. So the lung is enclosed in a sac, a double layered pleura, okay, parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. The parietal pleura is in close contact with the thoracic cavity, and the visceral pleura, which is the inner pleural membrane, is in contact with the lung surface. Talking about the thoracic chamber, it is an anatomical airtight setup. Okay, this is because of the fact that it is bound by all the sides, dorsally by the vertebral column, ventrally by the sternum, laterally by the ribs, and inferiorly by the diaphragm. So the anatomical setup is such that whenever there is any change in the volume of the thoracic cavity, it is reflected directly to the volume of the lung. So this anatomical setup is very important, is very essential for breathing. This shows that we cannot directly alter the volume of the lung. It is by altering the volume of the thoracic chamber we can alter the lung volumes. So now we have completed with the anatomical organization, the structural organization of the human respiratory system. Now let's move on to the mechanism of breathing and volumes and capacities of lung. So the main principle behind the mechanism of breathing is the pressure gradient that exists between the lungs and the atmosphere. So inspiration occurs only if the pressure within the lungs, that is the intrapulmonary pressure, is less than the atmospheric pressure. This means that there is a negative pressure in the lungs with respect to the atmospheric pressure. So only in this condition the inspiration occurs, whereas expiration occurs only when the intrapulmonary pressure is greater than the atmospheric pressure. So there is a positive intrapulmonary pressure with respect to the atmospheric pressure. So the muscles responsible for establishment of the pressure gradient are the diaphragm and the internal and external intercostal muscles. So what do we understand by the term intercostal? Inter meaning between, costal meaning ribs. So between the ribs, the muscles between the ribs. Present internally, they are the internal intercostal muscles. Present outer is the external intercostal muscles. So let's look at the muscles, the changes in the muscles and also the thoracic cavity volume that occurs. So during inspiration, all the muscles will contract. So diaphragm contracts, the external intercostal muscles contract. So what happens during inspiration? We're actually taking in air from the atmosphere and the air gets filled into the lungs, right? So lungs expand. So obviously the thoracic cavity, the volume of thoracic cavity also increases in all the directions, the anteroposterior direction as well as the superior inferior directions. So this is the overall idea of breathing. So let's understand how. So first, the pressure within the lungs is negative, and that is why inspiration becomes possible. So with this there is contraction of diaphragm. So what happens when diaphragm contracts? So when diaphragm contracts, it actually becomes flat. It becomes flat, that is it moves down. There is descent of diaphragm. So there is increase in the volume of thoracic chamber in the anteroposterior axis. So during inspiration, the diaphragm becomes flat. So it is important to understand the direction of the axes. Okay, anteroposterior. So anteriorly, what is present? Head is present, and posteriorly leg is present. So with respect to this, we define the axis anteroposterior axis, right? And then there is contraction of the external intercostal muscles. So with the external intercostal muscles, they will help in elevation of the ribs as well as the sternum. So the ribs move forward and outward. This in turn will increase the volume of the thoracic chamber in the dorsoventral axis. So again we should understand what is dorsoventral axis. So dorsoventral, so dorsal and ventral. So what is considered dorsal here? So the vertebral column is considered dorsal and the sternum is considered ventral. So in that direction the volume of the thoracic chamber increases. So in both anteroposterior as well as dorsoventral axis, the overall volume of the thoracic cavity has increased during respiration. So there is increase in thoracic volume. This leads to an increase in pulmonary volume as well. So we know by Boyle's law that volume and volume and pressure, they are inversely proportional. So as pulmonary volume increases, the pulmonary pressure, the intrapulmonary pressure decreases. The intrapulmonary pressure becomes less than the atmospheric pressure. So now the negative pressure is generated. As a result, inspiration now becomes possible. So air moves from outside into the lungs. So these are the events that happen during inspiration. So now let's look at the events that happen during expiration. So there is relaxation of both diaphragm as well as the intercostal muscles. So the diaphragm now becomes dome shaped, which is the normal position, and the sternum again, the sternum and the ribs, they come down to the normal position. So this results in the decrease of the volume of the thoracic cavity in both the anteroposterior direction as well as the dorsoventral direction, creating positive intrapulmonary pressure, which is a pressure slightly above the atmospheric pressure, causing expulsion of air from the lungs. So this is the mechanism of breathing. So remember that inspiration is an active process, whereas expiration is a passive process.